Hello and welcome. In a previous video we looked at the history of Wallace Arnold Coaches. So I thought in this video we'd take a look at their biggest rival, Shearings of Wigan. Now if you thought the Wallace Arnold story was complicated, wait till you watch this one. The story of Shearings encompasses several different operators, including Smiths, Blundells, Websters, Happyways and of course Shearings. The business of Smiths can be traced back to 1903 when William Webster started business in Wigan as a haulage and removals contractor and passenger carrier. The bus operations which he'd built up in the Wigan area was sold to Ribble Motor Services and Lancashire United Transport in 1927, but he retained the coaching side of the business, and this was to become Webster Brothers of Wigan. The company operated various tours as well as express services to North Wales and into Manchester. In 1931, this company purchased the coaching business of James Smith of Wigan, and a new company was formed, James Smith and Company Wigan Limited. The original Smith Coaches had begun in 1914. This company was known for operating extended tours from Wigan and Southport, with the first tour to John O'Groats in Scotland on a solid tired vehicle in 1914. Now that must have been quite something, wasn't it? We looked at the Wallace Arnold tours that they were doing with solid tired vehicles, but wow. And remember, these would have had a 12-mile-an-hour speed limit as well. By 1935, Webster's Tours, which was the original company, was being operated by the Smith Company. They started their first continental tours in 1938 and continued to the outbreak of war in 1939. That must have been quite hairy times to be going onto the continent, mustn't it? And in May 1946, the company organised an ambitious 14-day tour to Switzerland, and this was claimed to be the first European coach tour after the war. And this tour covered an amazing 1,625 miles. Now, you think of the infrastructure that had been destroyed in Europe during the Second World War, it must have been quite something really trying to plan a tour around all this damaged infrastructure and ruined buildings and everything like that. Absolutely amazing times, wasn't it? And this tour was taken in a 1936 Leyland. In 1958, the Webster brothers approached retirement and the associated companies of Websters and Smiths became available for sale. These companies were bought by Les Glebe, who was a local haulier and had quite a few companies under his belt. And some of those companies were coach touring companies in the Lancashire and Cheshire area, and these were ventures that he felt could be profitable in the future. Of these coach touring companies, they were split into three parts. There was Smiths and Webster companies based in Wigan, Florence Motors Limited, Grange Tours Limited and R.H. Harrison of Morecambe Limited, based in Morecambe, and Roberts Coaches Limited at Crewe. When Les Glebe acquired Websters and Smiths in 1958, he renamed it the Smiths Tours of Wigan Limited, and this became the main company in the group. At this point, the company fleet was 80 coaches, and they were standardised on AEC and Leyland chassis for the heavyweight vehicles and Bedfords for lightweights, which was pretty standard for the time. In 1964, Les Glebe sold the Websters and Smiths companies on to Wilf Blundell. Now, Wilfred Blundell was originally a butcher from Southport. However, when he returned from war service, he found that butchering didn't really pay and there wasn't an awful lot of business to be had in it. So, being a savvy businessman, he commenced operating a taxi service. In 1950, he gained his first school contract, which led him to purchase his first coach, which was, of course, a Bedford OB with duple vista bodywork. And it's recorded that this vehicle cost only £3, 12 shillings and sixpence in maintenance during its first 3 years of operation. The coach was driven by Wilfred and his wife Hilda, and they rapidly made additions to the fleet and commenced a series of takeovers of other businesses. After Wilf Blundell had taken over Websters and Smiths, the company was based in 3 depots. Southport, Wigan and Bootle, and it became self-sufficient in its engineering and body maintenance and repairs. At this time they had 120 staff and the head office overlooked Wigan Market Square, this being where many of the tours originated from and started. Webster's and Smith's introduced continental tours into the Blundell Group, and indeed in 1966 probably the most unusual vehicles operated in the UK were bought by Smith's. Now in 1964 an East German ship called the Magdeburg was carrying 42 Leyland Olympic buses destined for Cuba. And I have done a video on this, and I will try and remember to put a little link to it up in the top right hand corner. This East German ship collided with a Japanese freighter, and initially there were all sorts of questions and conspiracy theories going around that the CIA was involved. Remember, this is at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and relations between America, Europe and Cuba weren't particularly good. The buses that had been deck cargo were salvaged and brought back to Britain, where they were sold. The running units from 2 of these buses were subsequently purchased by Smith's Tours, which sent them to Belgium to be bodied by Van Hall integrally built 44-seat left-hand drive bodywork. Now the vehicles were left as left-hand drive because they were intended primarily for continental tours, and they became the only left-hand drive coaches licensed for use in Britain at that time. And it was quite a controversial thing at the time because being left-hand drive and British registered, they could actually be used in Britain as tour buses around the UK. And in the mid-1960s, the company purchased its first 2 hotels, the first one being the Bellevue at Eastbourne, which following the retirement of the proprietors, this being a hotel that the company had used for its tours, it was snapped up by the Blundell Group. Shortly after this, the Westwood Ho Hotel in New Quay was also purchased. However, this was later sold in 1965 to be replaced by the Grantham Astor, a larger hotel. Later, a 3rd hotel in Eastbourne, the Southdown, would also be bought. By 1980, no less than 9 hotels were owned, and these were located in Scotland, the South Coast, Devon and Cornwall. And these hotels were quite a success because at the time the hotel industry were going through a little bit of a phase where they weren't really interested in accepting coach passengers as accommodation. So the fact that the company owned these hotels where they could run tours to was an absolute bonus. And without doubt this contributed greatly to the success of all these tours that the Blundell Group were operating. In 1968, Wilf Blundell acquired Spencer's and Happyways from a Mr. Holden. Now, Stanley Spencer commenced trading in 1919, immediately after the First World War, with a Crosley open charabanc. Between 1920 and 24, he operated in partnership with Norman Orty from Brook Street in Bury. However, from 1927, the company became Stanley Spencer's Tours. And in 1956, Spencer sold the business to Mr. Edwin Holden, who had commenced business with his brother as Holden Brothers, again in 1919. Edwin Holden registered the company at a new address, 27 Lower Mosley Street in Manchester, which was opposite the Central Railway Station, which is now the GMEX Exhibition Centre. In 1957, Edwin Holden acquired Happyway Tours of Manchester from James Robinson of Oldham. Now, Happyway Tours of Manchester dated back to 1923, but remember that name, James Robinson, because he'll crop up in a little while. When Spencer's and Happyways was acquired by the Blundell Group, the company name was changed to Happyway Spencers Limited. However, by 1975, the better known Smith's Happyway Spencers was in use, and this company would be used to consolidate the Blundell Group's holiday interests. Sadly, Wilf Blundell died at an early age of 55 in 1978. However, his wife Hilda Blundell continued to be involved in the company. Now, interestingly, in 1974, Greater Manchester PTE, which had been formed to operate all the transport in the Manchester area, was looking to expand into the leisure side of the transport industry. And this resulted with it having an option to purchase an 80% share of the Blundell Group in 1975. However, due to a change of policy within the PTE, this option was later dropped 4 years later. How interesting is that? If Greater Manchester PTE had taken that option up, how different would life have been for both the Blundell Group and Shearings? In 1982, the Blundell Group was sold to the amusement machine and leisure park operator Associated Leisure Limited of London for £11 million. And from 1982, the Spencer name was dropped, with the resulting fleet name just being Smith's Happyways. And now we come to the namesake of the story itself, Shearings. Shearings started life as Herbert Shearing of Oldham, and this was in 1919. This was formed into a limited company in 1935 when the business of Anyway Motors of Manchester was taken over. In 1949, Herbert Shearing retired and the business passed to Wilfred Hackett. Hackett was running JW Fieldsend Limited of Salford. And 2 years later, they formed two new companies, Shearings Tours of Manchester Limited and Shearings Tours of Oldham Limited, with the Oldham company taking over the excursions licence of the original company. See, I told you this was a little bit complicated, didn't I? Over the next few years, various companies were taken over. In 1953, the Manchester side of the business passed to James Robinson. Now, if you remember, I had previously mentioned James Robinson of Oldham, as he had been the original owner of Happyway Tours Limited of Manchester, which he'd sold on to Edwin Holden, who'd then been taken over by Wilf Blundell and the Blundell Group. However, he kept hold of the Shearings holiday name and in 1963 sold this on to the Jackson family of Altrincham. The Jacksons had started working with horse transport in Moss Lane, Altrincham in the late 19th century, and some of their early coal wagons were converted into coaches for weekends. That must have made a bit of a mess, all that coal dust laying around, mustn't it? The company had continued to grow, and one of the companies that had helped it when they needed duplicate services and extra vehicles was Shearings of Manchester, which had been running vehicles on hire to the Jacksons. So when it was decided to sell Shearings of Manchester, the Jackson family were given the first option to buy it. The Jackson Group commenced using the fleet name Shearings Pleasureways Ribblesdale, although some coaches were noted carrying the fleet name Jackson's Shearings Pleasureways Ribblesdale. By 1979, however, this had been shortened to Shearings Ribblesdale and simply to Shearings Holidays in 1982. By this point, the company had a highly standardised coach fleet of 133, and these were all Fords with Plaxton coachwork, plus 3 Bedford minibuses. In 1982, Shearings decided to switch to a more heavyweight vehicle, and they moved from Ford chassis to DAFs. In 1980, Shearings was one of the original members of the British Coachways consortium, which we looked at in the Wallace Arnold story. And together with Wallace Arnold, Morris Brothers of Swansea, Grey Green of London, Ellerman, Beeline of Middlesbrough, and Parks of Hamilton, they went in to compete with National Express. The idea was to attempt to run a high-class express operation. But again, as I mentioned in the Wallace Arnold video, the British Coachways wasn't a total success, as there were all these different coach companies involved with all these different ideas and different policies, and a lot of them were rivals. And yes, you have asked for a video on the British Coachways saga, and yes, I will be doing one in the very near future. At the end of 1983, the shares of Jacksons of Altrincham, which incorporated Shearings, were offered for sale upon the retirement of Don Jackson. Now, as I'd already mentioned, Associated Leisure Limited had taken over Blundell Holiday Group in March 1982, and they were very interested in acquiring these shares of Jacksons. However, by now they were Associated Leisure plc, and it was successful in its bid and took control in January 1984, and this brought under common ownership the two historic companies of Smith's and Shearings. Now, just to complicate things even more, at the time, Associated Leisure plc was facing a takeover bid from the Pleasurama Group, and this proved to be successful within a matter of weeks, and both the Smiths and the Shearings Group, which had been consolidated and renamed Smiths Shearings, became a subsidiary of Pleasurama plc. From 1985, the fleet name was revised to read Smiths Shearings Limited. With the consolidation of the fleet came the consolidation of the vehicle types as well, with the outstanding DAFs that the Shearings fleet had originally ordered being cancelled in favour of Smith's standard type, which was the Volvo B10M coach chassis. Smiths had also favoured Van Hall coachwork, which was built in Belgium. However, they did maintain a small amount of British-built coach bodies as well. With the introduction of the 1985 Transport Act in July 1986 saw the first section of the National Bus Company come up for sale, and this was National Holidays Limited. This being acquired by the Smiths Shearings parent company, Pleasurama plc, for £2.5 million. Now, National Holidays was different from the other operating subsidiaries of the National Bus Company in that it actually owned no vehicles itself. It would contract vehicles to be used from National Bus Company's subsidiaries. The purchase of National Holidays obviously included the right to the famous National Holidays logo and the livery of white, red and blue, and a number of the new coaches were delivered in this new livery. However, from 1989 the fleet name was changed from National Holidays to Shearings National. In addition to the National Holidays purchase, both Smiths and Shearings had operated National Express contracts for National Express itself, and a number of vehicles were painted in full National Express and National Express Rapide livery. These routes operated between the Midlands, Aberdeen, Edinburgh, Leeds, Manchester and Bournemouth. From deregulation of the bus industry, Smiths Shearings decided to enter the bus market with a fleet of second-hand Leyland Nationals in a version of the company's famous livery. Now, the company had been operating a limited amount of local bus services and some school bus services as well, but this was the result of a company that they'd taken over. In 1986, the company successfully obtained a number of bus contracts, these being in Lancashire, Greater Manchester, Derbyshire, Cheshire and one in Wales, as well as one in Shropshire. As mentioned previously, the company went for a fleet of second-hand Leyland Nationals. However, they soon discovered that these were costing quite a lot to keep on the road. They were somewhere in the region of the £20,000 mark per annum to keep in service, taking into account that a new bus at that time was costing £60,000. Now, the company had wanted to standardise on Bristol REs, but the problem was at that time everybody else was buying Bristol REs, and trying to find good quality ones on the second-hand market was proving to be pretty much impossible. Pleased with the way their bus operations were going, in 1987 Shearings decided to order 4 Leyland Lynxes. New vehicles were now seen as the way forward rather than operating rather costly second-hand examples. Although there's no doubt that the Leyland Lynx was a good vehicle, it didn't quite fit into what Shearings wanted from a bus, and this resulted in them going over to the Leyland Tiger chassis, but these would be bodied by Alexander's Belfast factory, and these would be fitted with the N-type bodywork, which seated 55 passengers. This combination had become virtually the standard single-decker bus for Ulster Bus in Northern Ireland. However, this combination on mainland Britain was virtually unheard of. As in their earlier years of existence, Shearings brought in a policy of buying up key bus operators in certain areas, and this policy would see Archway Motors of Shifnal come into the company fold in 1989, and this would see the introduction of routes in Shrewsbury and the Newport area. Further bus services came into the Shearings Group in 1990, and this was probably about as far away from Wigan as you could get when they purchased Eagle Coaches of Tunbridge Wells in April 1990. The routes inherited here included some Tunbridge Wells local services, a Heathfield service and a Sundays only route to Gillingham. However, it wasn't long before Shearings sold on their bus services and their buses, most of which passed to First Group, However, the Leyland Lynxes were sold on to Maidstone Borough Line, a company we've covered in a previous video. These ended up in the ownership of Arriva. Now, while all this was going on, the Pleasurama Group had sold out to the Mecca Leisure Group in 1989. However, just to confuse things even more, the Rank organisation took over the Mecca Group in 1990. And this does seem to be a problem, doesn't it, when these companies are sold to large groups or investment corporations, that they do get pushed around from pillar to post and they do tend to lose their identity. And this is no exception. In the mid-1990s, the Barr family, who owned Shearing's biggest competitor, Wallace Arnold, decided to retire. And it was strongly assumed that Shearings Holidays would indeed take over the Wallace Arnold company. However, as we saw in our previous video about Wallace Arnold, the successful outcome in 1997 turned out to be a management buyout which was backed by a venture capital firm 3i. Slightly before this, in 1996, Rank Leisure had sold Shearings to a management buyout team which had been backed by Bridgepoint Capital. In 2005, 3i, which remember was the company that supported the management buyout at Wallace Arnold, bought a controlling share of Shearings and promptly merged the two companies to become Wallace Arnold Shearings. These two competitors were now under the same umbrella and common ownership. Sadly, the WA Shearings brand was dropped and the Wallace Arnold name went into the history books. At this point in 2005, the company was valued at being worth £200 million. That's not bad for a coach company, is it? However, the company was losing money, and by 2014 it was sold to a management-led buyout again. This time it was for an undisclosed amount, but the speculation is that it was less than 10% of how it was valued in 1995, which was the £200 million mark. So although it sounds like the management got a good deal there when they bought it, you can imagine there must have been quite a lot of debts around the company at the time for them to sell it that cheaply, especially as these were investment corporations who were selling it, and they don't normally miss a trick with money, do they? At this point, the company owned over 200 coaches and over 52 hotels. 2 years later, in April 2016, the company was sold yet again to a private equity firm called Lone Star Funds. They sound a bit of a cowboy outfit, don't they? Now, by this time, the parent company of Shearings had become Specialist Leisure Group, and later this was to become Shearings Leisure Group. And Lone Star had considered selling the parent company of Specialist Leisure Group at least twice before the whole lot went into administration in May 2020. Now, remember when I said the management buyout team got a bargain, but there must have been debts around it? When the company declared bankruptcy, there were debts of £200 million. Now, at that time, the Shearings Leisure Group had several other brands attached to it, including not only Shearings Holidays, and of course Wallace Arnold, but Caledonian Travel, UK Coast and Country Hotels, Bay Hotels, Country Living Hotels, and ukbreakaways.com, all of which ceased trading. The blame was laid squarely on the door of the COVID-19 pandemic, with it being reported that the company would have struggled with all the refunds given for all the cancelled holidays during the lockdown period. And of course, in those strange post-lockdown times, people were very reluctant to mix with the fear of COVID still around. And of course, the whole point of coach travel is that you mix with people and meet new friends. So of course, coach holidays and coach trips were fallen out of favour. In June 2020, the Shearings brand, but not the coaches or any of its properties, were purchased by Ledger Group. Now, along with the brand, Ledger got the rights to the customer database and the Shearings website. And you'll find this with a lot of coach company takeovers, that sometimes no vehicles are included. However, the customer database is the more valuable thing, and that's what's sold along with the name. And this doesn't just happen with large companies, it happens with small companies as well. In 1997, when the company Eastern Ways of Ramsgate sold their coach operations to King's Ferry, all King's Ferry were interested in was the company's coach book, which of course included all the customer database, which also contained all the prices and all the jobs they've done over the last few years. So this sort of practice isn't unusual. In 2021, the first season that Ledger would be operating Shearings, they had a planned 30 tours, and a revised blue livery was applied to the vehicles. Today, Shearings operate as a one-stop travel shop, offering everything from coach trips to river cruises to self-drive holidays. And no, that doesn't mean you get to drive the coach on your own. And I have to admit, it's great to see the Shearings coaches back out on the road again and see the name emblazoned on the side of the vehicles. It's a shame that a company with such a long history has gone through a lot of changes and a lot of owners, but I guess that just reflects the changes in the industry and the different trends for coach holidays, doesn't it? Well, I do hope you enjoyed this rather long and complicated look at a famous coach operator from Wigan. Ironically, Wallace Arnold were quite often referred to as either Wally's Trolleys or Wigan Airways, when in fact they came from Leeds and Shearings came from Wigan. So maybe Shearings is the original Wigan Airways, taking you all around Europe. Thank you so very much for watching this video, and I hope that it's not been too long and too tedious and too boring for you. And don't forget to share your memories and comments on Shearings in the comments down below. I do love reading all your comments, and I do try to respond to each one individually if I can. So share with us, did you work for Shearings? Have you been on a Shearings coach holiday? Do you know people who have? And which of the Shearings liveries do you prefer? Now, I must admit, I'm quite partial to the very modern one, the one from Ledger with the flash of yellow on it. I think that's rather classy looking. If you did enjoy this video, please like and share it, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss out my future releases on this and my other series here on YouTube. In future episodes, we'll be looking at such things as the Leyland Tiger, Green Line coaches, and indeed National Express and Rapide coaches. And don't forget to check out my extensive back catalogue of videos, because there's something in there for everyone. And you look like a bus enthusiast of good taste, so I'm sure you'll find something there that will match and fit that good taste of yours. All money raised by YouTube goes to the upkeep of the buses in the Southern Counties Omnibus collection. So by watching this video, you're helping old buses live a fine life in their retirement, and that makes you a pretty ace character, doesn't it? Once again, thank you very much for watching. Bye for now.